War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 33, Asymmetric Warfare. The astute amongst you will note that I called last week's episode as also episode 33. So episode 32 is lost to history. All apologies and applause to those who happen to notice. There are many different words and phrases used to describe this week's episode, but I start with the most expansive deliberately. In the literal sense, asymmetric means two entities, not the same. I would hope, if you have listened to previous episodes, you'll realize that all warfare should be considered asymmetric. That is, two sides go to war. Each will have the distinct advantage and disadvantage. That the capable commander and strategist will target their enemy's weakness with their strength. B.H. Liddell Hart's indirect approach, obviously Sun Tzu, even shades of Corbett. If two militaries do engage in symmetrical, peer, or regular warfare, whatever that may be, it can only be due to incompetence or ignorance on at least one belligerent's part. A good example is Desert Storm in 1991. Saddam Hussein determined that he could defeat the U.S.-led coalition ground forces if he could survive the initial air attacks. His assumption was not without strong considerations. He had a very large armored force, he was fighting in the defensive, and his officer corps had 8 years of combat experience fighting in the desert with mechanized forces. He did not have to completely destroy the U.S. forces. Rather, he needed to inflict enough casualties to cause domestic support for the war at home to wane and force the democracies aligned against him to abandon the cause of liberating Kuwait. In a basic analysis, it was solid, but it missed some key aspects. First, the combat experience of the Iraqis was against an Iranian army that had effectively no trained officer corps. That had been eviscerated when the Shah fell. They missed the quantitative advantage of the Western armored forces, specifically in night vision. Finally, while U.S. forces had no desert combat experience since World War II, all U.S. forces had gone to the National Training Center in Fort Irwin, California, a desert. Every American officer of the rank of major or above had significant training experience against a professional opposing force, known as the OPFOR, in the desert, fighting in both the offense and the defense, day and night. In the end, Saddam wasn't stupid. He was simply ignorant of the force multipliers that made the 100-hour ground war of Desert Storm one of the most decisive victories in history, and Saddam learned from his mistakes. In 2003, during Operation Iraqi Freedom, or, if you prefer, Desert Storm Part 2, Saddam essentially offered no defense to the Allied armored forces. Rather, he had his army disintegrate into decentralized infantry forces, contesting the towns and villages, nullifying our armored advantage, and turning our casualty-averse culture against us. It is in this context that most people think of asymmetric warfare. Some other terms for this is guerrilla warfare, which is somewhat redundant, as guerrilla is simply the diminutive of the French word for war, guerre. Then there is small war, irregular war, as opposed to regular war, insurgent war, itself a specific subset indicating a type of civil war of the established government versus a rebellious domestic opponent. It would be convenient to define it as nation-state versus a non-nation state, but that might exclude some possibilities. How would one define the latter half of the Vietnam War, as it was North Vietnamese versus the South Vietnamese army, the insurgent Viet Cong having been effectively destroyed by 1968? But it certainly wasn't a traditional war. Indeed, one might argue that the NVA, or People's Army of Vietnam, were in a holding action, allowing the demoralization campaign taking place in the United States following Tet to attrit U.S. forces, which it did amazingly well. But was this guerrilla war? I'd argue no, but it was certainly asymmetric. The North Vietnamese and their Chinese and Russian allies waging primarily an information campaign with military efforts as secondary, until, by 1972, they decided on a disastrous conventional invasion of South Vietnam in what became known as the Easter Offensive. From 1967 to 1970, the Arab-Israeli conflict became a war of attrition. The Arabs were incapable of defeating Israel in a coup de main, but here it was indecisive harassment using conventional means such as airstrikes and artillery duels across the Suez Canal. It was, in fact, this conflict that gave birth to the term asymmetric warfare, in popular use at least. by the Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir. So we can't simply limit the definition between nation-states and non-nation states. I have taken to calling it sub-existential conflict, meaning the means used in the conflict do not pose an existential threat to the stronger party involved. Ultimately, a war designed to make the long-term squeeze not worth the perceived immediate juice. A war of harassment. Some have called this the flea versus the elephant. This type of warfare is defined by the, at times, staggering differences in inherent military strength between the two direct belligerents. Like all war, the centers of gravity at every level still exist, though they will be far different than what one would see in a peer-on-peer conflict such as World War II. These types of wars generally devolve to two conflicting requirements. The weaker party, the insurgent, or the guerrilla, needs to survive. The stronger party, or counterinsurgent, or government forces, need to endure the pressure. The key for the counterinsurgent is to deny refuge to the weaker, and the key for the insurgent is to deny popular support for the war. Insurgent tactics simply do not work against dictatorships unless the insurgents are very well supplied and supported by third parties. These can be seen as proxy wars. Vietnam was a proxy war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Afghanistan, circa 1980 to 1988, was a proxy war between the two same parties. Afghanistan more recently was, in effect, a proxy war between the United States and, it must be admitted, Pakistan, nominally an American ally. The most recent war in Iraq was between the United States and, one might say, Iran. Many have stated that it is exceedingly difficult to defeat an insurgency, that the guerrilla always wins, which is nonsense. In fact, most insurgencies lose. Thucydides and the history of Rome demonstrated that amply. The history of the Israelites was one of losing insurgencies to Rome and Babylonia, very nearly losing to the Greeks. The current war between Hamas and Israel certainly isn't going Hamas's way. The Native Americans and Boers will testify to the difficulty of winning against a stronger power. Intuitively, the stronger power, nodding back to Clausewitz, should usually win. The question isn't one of absolute strength, but rather available strength, which is why this warfare dominated the post-Cold War era and will continue to dominate for the foreseeable future: nuclear weapons. The power available to nuclear powers is, for all intents and purposes, incalculable. Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, North Vietnam, and North Korea could all have been defeated in mere minutes if we had so chosen to do so. But this was not a viable course of action. The conflicts themselves were not existential, but to expand them to a nuclear exchange could make it so, if not in an absolute sense, then almost certainly in a political or diplomatic sense. It is for these reasons the ongoing fantasy discussions of near-peer conflict with China is similarly ridiculous. The possibility of direct Soviet-U.S. conflict through the Warsaw Pact nations and NATO was far greater, as both were stationed at times mere yards from each other. At the arguable height of a comparative American power, we could not defeat a far weaker People's Liberation Army in Korea, whether from will or military force notwithstanding. So, despite the military desire of our military and the defense contractors who serve it for a revisiting of the Cold War, both strategically and from a procurement standpoint, asymmetric or sub-existential warfare will remain the norm for the foreseeable future. The U.S. military's doctrine for a regular war can fairly be called a cut and paste from a French officer, David Galula. His most famous book, Counterinsurgency Warfare, Theory and Practice, written in 1964, is quite simplistic, which appeals to the average officer. It lists 4 primary laws of counterinsurgency. The aim of the war is to gain the support of the population. The population will largely be neutral. You only need an active minority. You must protect the population from the enemy. The key is progressive steps of driving away the enemy, gaining the support of the population, and strengthening the position by building infrastructure and investing in relationships with the population. You may have heard the terms hearts and minds, as well as clear, hold, build. Yeah, that's Galula rewarmed in the microwave. Galula's perspective was shaped by both Mao Zedong, he was briefly a prisoner of the Chinese communists in the 1940s, as well as his combat experience in Algeria during the 1950s. In both cases, the insurgents and primary power saw themselves as co-nationalists of the civilian population. His perspective was not one of defeating an insurgency on a foreign land, despite how the native Arabs of Algeria viewed the French, but rather defeating an enemy in a civil war. It must be noted that, despite his tactical success in Algeria, the French lost. This might define the greatest difference between insurgency warfare and regular war. The center of gravity at the grand strategy level is often the cause for which one fights. The vast majority of violent counterinsurgencies were either motivated by Islam or by communism. The materialistic nature of communist ideology, the poor taking from the rich, is countered far more easily than the ethereal promises of Allah to reward the martyrs who fight in His name. Successful communist insurgencies, such as in Rhodesia, were a military victory by a China-supported and supplied Shona manned Zanla, as well as the Soviet-supported Nedabeli manned Zipra, defeating the isolated Rhodesians, who received little to no support externally. Militarily, the Rhodesians were superior on a man-to-man basis and had the support of a good portion of the population. Military might still matters. Communist talking points were countered with relative ease, and captured communist guerrillas often converted to fight for Ian Smith's government. Afghanistan was a different matter, both for the Soviets as well as the Americans. No matter how nicely we treated the Pashtuns, we were not Pashtuns, nor were the bulk of the officers of the Afghan army. And the Taliban, by and large, were. No matter how brutal the Taliban was to the native population, we could never win their hearts and minds, rendering our rewarmed Galula ultimately irrelevant. This is not to say victory was impossible. When strong fights weak, the fight becomes one of mobility and space, a Corbett-style fight where gaining temporary control of key pieces of land through violence and then abandoning them the moment they lose their importance, never sacrificing the mass of your forces in a fight. The weaker party can never win this way. The key for the counterinsurgent is to deny the mobility of your weaker opponent, to move faster than they can, marshaling superior power whenever the opportunity presents itself. In Vietnam and Rhodesia, tactically, helicopters provided this superior mobility. One of my great frustrations and ironies was that in Afghanistan, we largely abandoned air mobility and reverted to armored cars, little different than ones seen in World War I. Our most critical advantage, aircraft, squandered to irrelevance due to their expense. Exquisite toys saved solely for the elite, whether by rank or unit. And once you have garnered this mobility, you must deny the enemy any refuge. The strategic center of gravity for almost any insurgent will invariably be their refuge. If you can deny them refuge, then, eventually, the stronger power can grind them down. In our fight against the Plains Indians, we followed them with horse cavalry, seizing their winter quarters and forcing them into reservations. In the Boer War, concentration camps were created to house the Boer civilians, refusing the commandos refuge, then dividing the land into blocks with barbed wire and mutually supporting detachments. While the British never countered the superior mobility of the Boers, they denied them a place to flee and forced their capitulation. In Vietnam, we initially ceded Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam, refusing to take the fight to the safe havens of our enemy. Likewise, in Korea, after MacArthur's relief, North Korea was essentially off limits. In Rhodesia, the Zanlas and Zipras found safe refuge in Zambia. While the Rhodesians did make several attacks on the communist guerrillas in Zambia, no long-term intrusions were possible. In Afghanistan, the Taliban could use Iran and Pakistan as safe havens, immune from American or Afghan security forces' attacks. This refuge need not always be a different neighboring nation. In Cuba, an island and, in theory, one of the easier counterinsurgent missions, the mountains provided a refuge Batista's army found impenetrable. Mao spoke of the guerrillas swimming among the people like fish in a sea. His refuge was found in the population of China, and, in China, the population is so vast that its comparison to the sea is apt. A strategy of concentration camps similar to the British in the Boer War would be impossible. If, as the stronger party, you cannot eliminate external support and untouchable bases, the war will go on as long as the cause is sufficient to garner support. The hearts and minds is not irrelevant, but it is the long-term objective. Ultimately, in Algeria, the French lost because the French government lost the support of the French people. For the insurgent, the priority first and foremost is to survive. Then it is to undermine the support of the counterinsurgent, whether through terrorism, giving the population an offer they can't refuse, or by eroding the righteousness of their enemy's cause. Insurgency was in vogue throughout the Cold War, first as the Soviet Union used it as an asymmetric means of attacking the non-communist West, and because anti-colonialism was trendy in certain political circles in Western populations. This trend created and funded by deliberate Soviet policy, and it worked. There is no inevitability of victory in any war. The strong always has the advantage over the weak. But, As Napoleon taught, the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. This is true in the tightest confines of close combat, as well as in the clash of great nations and causes. With this all too brief overview of asymmetric warfare, we can now take a look at the current situation in Syria. Who won? Who lost? What the future may hold? And what lessons are there to be gleaned? See you next week. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit, and check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.